Hi. Shelley asked me on YouTube what sort of loom she should buy, and I certainly get asked this question a lot of times, so I thought I could just put together a video giving my opinions and comparisons of the two looms that I currently have, and that might help other people, and I can refer people to this video instead of answering the question every time. First of all, it's a very good idea, if at all possible, to try somebody's loom. If you have a friend who has a loom, if you have a weaving guild, if you have someone who teaches classes, whatever it may be, so that you can try out different sorts of looms and see what actually suits you. Obviously as well, if you have already been having weaving classes, depending on the type of weaving that you've been doing, you may be a little more informed about the type of loom that you want to choose. But if, like me, when you start out, and I had never woven anything before, I wasn't really sure what to do. I did talk to a few other weavers, and then I decided to start with something basic, which for me was the rigid heddle loom. I chose that because, number one was the price factor, that it was an affordable setup for me at the time, and also that it seemed a more simple sort of loom. So if you want to have a go at weaving and you haven't woven before, something like the rigid heddle loom is a very good place to start, because if you buy something that is more complex, more expensive, you may find that you don't actually enjoy weaving on it as much as you thought that you might. So what I've done here is I've got a list, and I've written out some pros and cons for each loom. And I have to say, there are a lot of pros and not many cons for the rigid heddle loom. So let's start with that one. This one here I've got is a 60 centimetre, which I think is 24 inches wide. If I had my time again, I would probably buy the wider one. But this one's, it serves me pretty well, but for things like baby blankets, I'd like just that little bit of extra width. Okay, so the pros for the rigid heddle loom: it's very portable. You can put it on a stand or you can put it on a table. If you have it on a stand, it's very easy to unattach from the stand, pick it up, chuck it in the car, take it to another room, take it outside, whatever you want to do. It's extremely portable, and some rigid heddle looms are also flip looms, so you can actually fold it in to make it even more compact, put it in a bag and just pick it up and take it that way. Okay, I've written that they're lightweight. Obviously that comes into portability. Easy to learn. Alright, when I first got my loom I was a bit bewildered by it, but and it has taken me a fair while to be really comfortable with it. But on the scale of different types of looms, this is very easy to learn. Warping and everything, it takes a little while to get used to it, but once you are used to it, it's quick, it's easy, and then you can start delving into the more complex patterns and things like that. There are many possibilities with a rigid heddle loom. It can seem a bit limited because it's a 2-shaft loom. If you compare that to a 4 or an 8 shaft, or even more shafts than that, you might think that it's extremely simple and very limited. But with the use of pickup sticks, with the use of 2 heddles, heddle rods, all of those things, some of the things I've been through in other videos, it is very versatile, and you can get all kinds of patterns on it. And the more I look online and in books and other resources, the more I see that you can actually do on this loom. Now, I've had this loom for I don't know, 4.5 years or something like that, and still really only feel like I've scratched the surface of what can actually be achieved on it. Okay, I wanted to mention warping. Well, warping is just so fast on a rigid heddle loom. I can think of a project, warp it up and start weaving all in the same day or the same night even. Once you know the warping and you understand it and you've done it many times, it's just so fast. The other thing about warping is there's hardly any waste on a rigid heddle loom, and I really like that because I find it very, very hard wasting yarn at all. I know how much I have to pay for it, so it's very hard to waste it, and I just don't like being a wasteful person anyway. Okay, another pro is it's really comfortable to sit at, really comfortable. I've shown in another video how, I think it was the video with the stand, why I like my stand, how I can get right up to the loom, and it's just everything's accessible. It doesn't feel too big, and it's very comfortable to use. And cost effectiveness, I've also mentioned that it's, for a full setup, it's much cheaper than a table loom or any other loom. Alright, cons. I've written down there's more fiddling around for some results. Okay, so what I mean by that is, I was saying about the possibilities before of all the different patterns you can use and everything. With a loom like this, because it's a 2-shaft, if you want to do a 3, 4, 5, 6 shaft pattern, you're going to have to find the way to make those shafts. So that might be pickup sticks, it might be heddle rods and that sort of thing. It might be using 2 heddles. But generally those sorts of patterns are easier to achieve on a loom with more shafts. Just because the shafts are already there for you, you don't have to make them, you don't have to fiddle around tying things up to try and make them. The heddle sizes. Okay, so there are limited heddle sizes for rigid heddle looms. They're bringing out more sizes all the time, and they've got the very dense sizes, the ones with, you know, you can use thick yarn and thin yarn in the same warp and that sort of thing. So they are branching out with the heddle sizes, but because it's a rigid heddle, the heddle doesn't move, the heddles don't move, then that is somewhat limiting. I find that the rigid heddle loom, I tend to use it for thicker yarns. I don't have, the smallest reed I've got is a 12 dent. There is now a 15 dent available as well. I'd consider getting that at some point because I sort of prefer to weave finer things. If you are like an art yarn lover, if you like, you know, chunky yarn and you like texture and all of that, then this is a fantastic loom for you. And you know, you can go right down to like a 5 dent, which is very wide for thick yarn. But for me personally, I like to weave things that are a bit finer generally. So I find that I usually use this with thicker yarns. It's just something to think about. And now this point, which, you know, I wrote this down, but it's perhaps a little bit controversial. I think of my rigid heddle loom a little bit like a play loom. What do I mean by that? Well, it's sort of, because it's easier to use, it's fun and quick. I do think of it as a little bit less serious sort of a loom. And I think my table loom, that's like an in-between getting more serious loom, and then a floor loom is a serious loom. That's just my personal reflections on different types of looms, but I definitely feel like a floor loom is for serious weavers. You can make of that what you like. Maybe this is all just my opinion. So now I will go through the pros and cons of the table loom. So my table loom has 8 shafts. It's an 80 centimeter wide, which I think is 31 inches. Not too good with the metric imperial conversions. And I bought the table loom last year. I bought it as an alternative to a floor loom, and I'll go through the pros of it first. Okay, first of all, I love the patterns you can weave on this. It's an 8-shaft loom, but I've only so far used 4 shafts or 3 shafts because there's so much to explore just within those boundaries that I haven't even bothered to try an 8-shaft pattern yet. I find actually a lot of the time that I somehow prefer the 4-shaft patterns. They're just more appealing to me personally. So that's one thing. Intricate patterns, really interesting combinations. It does have quite a few similarities to a floor loom, though I feel like it's probably only halfway there. The similarities would be, you know, you have the heddles, you have the shafts. It has similar warping in a similar way, winding on in a similar way. You can use a boat shuttle. That's not to say you can't use a boat shuttle with a rigid heddle loom. You can, but you need the thinner yarns. Thicker yarns with boat shuttle, just it's not really worth the trouble. So further to that boat shuttle, a boat shuttle is somewhat easier to use than a stick shuttle, because I guess you can kind of shoot it across. I mean, ultimately you're throwing it, though I find on this table loom that I can't really achieve the sort of tension on it that I would need to throw the boat shuttle right across the full width of the loom. So if I was making a scarf or something like that was my last project on the table loom, because it was only a certain width, throwing the shuttle was easy, and that was great because it's faster. So that's another pro. Another one is the castle is collapsible, so I'm not sure if you can see, but this is the castle here. That collapses down, so it folds down, and so that way it's easy to put more or less shafts in, put shafts in or remove shafts, and it also makes it a little bit more compact. If you need to move it, you can collapse that down so that the height is not so, it's not so high. And I think also the table looms are pretty cost effective. Maybe not when you compare them to a rigid heddle loom, but when you compare them to a floor loom, then they're definitely cost effective. Okay, the cons of the table loom. You need a strong table to put it on. This is not negotiable. It has to be a strong table. It's quite heavy. You need 2 people to move this because of the size and the weight. Whereas with the rigid heddle, I can easily move that on my own. Now, this is something I didn't realise before I bought my table loom, is a lot of people use them standing up. Now that doesn't appeal to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, I like to be really comfortable when I'm weaving. It's a relaxing time for me, so if I've been on my feet with the kids most of the day, I don't particularly feel like standing in the evenings to weave. And the other thing is I've got back issues, and standing would, I'm sure, inflame my back. So I do find it hard to get comfortable at the table loom just because of the way it is. Maybe if I had it on a stand it might be better, but on the table I just find it hard to get close enough and get the right angle, and it's just not as comfortable as the little rigid heddle. A table loom is not as portable as a rigid heddle loom, although there are more portable versions available, ones that fold down, but that's more for the shorter widths, not for a big thing like this. Okay, another con for this one, you need to be really accurate when you're counting your heddles for your project. I've been caught short a few times where I thought that I counted them accurately, but then you get to threading and you find there aren't enough heddles on one of the shafts. I mean, it's not a huge issue because you can actually make heddles out of cotton and put them on, but I can't actually slide any more. I've got textile heddles on this. I can't actually slide any more on once I've started warping and threading. So that's been a little bit of an issue for me. Okay, one of the biggest issues is the amount of waste. As I mentioned before, the rigid heddle doesn't have much waste. The table loom has a lot of waste. And I'm still trying to think of ways that I can get around that so that maybe try some different tie-on methods and that sort of thing to minimise waste. Table loom takes a long time to warp and thread in comparison to the rigid heddle. You need to use a warping board and then bring the warp to the loom and thread it up that way, and that can take hours. It depends on the complexity of your pattern, but it usually takes me hours. One other con of the table loom is it has a small shed compared to rigid heddle, and from what I've read, compared to a floor loom. The table loom, I don't know if it's this table loom in particular, but it does have a smaller shed, so you need to advance fairly often, which for me means getting up, going around to the side and advancing. Because it's a larger loom, if I'm sitting at the rigid heddle and I need to advance, I just stay seated, lean around to the side, advance the warp, but not so with this one. Okay, so I know I've sounded a bit negative about the table loom, but it has really opened up a lot of possibilities for me in my mind about weaving, because, as I said, it is a bit more of a serious loom. It's more complex, so I think it's really helped me to get into that weaving mindset, and also my weaving's just really taken off since I got this table loom. But you know, I just wanted you to be aware of these things because it can be really hard to know which loom to start out with. But as I said, if you're an absolute beginner, I don't think you can go wrong with a rigid heddle loom. And I don't earn anything by saying that. That's just my honest opinion. And I just think, well, if you start out on a rigid heddle loom and you find that you really enjoy weaving, you can always upgrade to something bigger later on. You don't need to take that leap initially. But, yep, it depends on you. I hope that this has helped some people just to know some of the differences between the looms. And good luck with your weaving journey.